Hey guys, Youngblood with you, and I already did a what is video on the GN Nox, and that was a ship that we saw highlighted in some documentation in the background of the video. And there was one other ship that caught our eyes that we hadn't seen before, and that's the Sabre Raven. Now this is a ship that could take on a lot of different possibilities based on what we've seen and how we've seen other ships play out. For example, in the Vanguard line, we've seen different variants actually equating to many different roles, being torpedo boat or E-War or dropship. In other ships like the Gladius, Sabre, and Avenger, we've seen the new variants, quote unquote, were really more of a loadout and skin change, including the Valiant, the Comet, and the Renegade. So what path are they going to take with the Sabre Raven? The short answer is, unfortunately, we don't know. But let's talk through some of the possibilities anyway. One option is that something that Ben hinted at a while ago during, I think, a Ben's day, and that was something in the role of a retaliator, but more stealth-focused. Now, if that's the case, then a name like the Raven sort of makes sense, but honestly, the Sabre platform is pretty small to really be an effective torpedo bomber, and I think something like the Harbinger is already filling that need, even if it's not stealth at this point. I think if they really wanted to do the stealth torpedo ship, it should be a bigger ship than the Sabre, and thus should be a different ship altogether in my mind, losing the Sabre name. I guess you could probably scrap some of the pylon mounts and just toss on one big torpedo on it or something like that, but that just doesn't feel quite right to me as far as the direction they may go. Another possibility, though at this point I think it's pretty unlikely to be the case, would be that the Eclipse could just be renamed to the Sabre Raven. Now, I'm operating under the assumption that this is a new ship or a variant or a loadout at this point, so I guess let's focus more on this being built on the Sabre platform. I think there's a few options that we could consider. First off, being an electronic warfare version of the ship. There aren't a ton of electronic warfare ships in game, really the Herald, the Sentinel, and the Warlock, so I could see a fighter in that category being a fairly decent option. The Raven was also a U.S. Air Force ship focused on signal jamming and E-War from a few decades ago. And CIG does seem to kind of like to tip their hat to different ships that they've drawn information from and kind of inspiration from, so that could be a point in the favor of the Raven being an E-War platform. Now this could take on a few different paths, most likely in my mind doing this as a different loadout, like the Comet, giving it data spike missiles instead of the conventional weapon loadouts, and potentially different scanners and arrays instead of a few different weapons. It could also just end up being an even more stealthy version of the Sabre, painting it all black, changing it to smaller weapons and engines to even further lower the signature it puts out. And I think the final option is it could, I think we could consider here is some sort of Super Sabre. Now this has been brought up in a few places, but I think it's the least likely option of the three. A Super Sabre could be a two-seater version, but there isn't a turret to control like on the Super Hornet, so the ship is already incredibly powerful with 4 size 3 weapons, so I don't think you're going to see a version that has bigger weapons, power plants, shields, or really anything like that, because then you get into a balancing quagmire. So then we say there's not really a point to having the second seat in the Sabre anyways. So while maybe it's something that appears as like a training mission in Squadron 42 and has 2 seats, I highly doubt this ends up being a Super Sabre that we end up using in the persistent universe. I think at this point the most likely option is the electronic warfare one that I discussed, probably living between a loadout change and a variant, giving you different avionics and different weapons on hard points, but not being a totally different ship. Basically, I bet you buy this as an E-War version of the ship, but a different Sabre could probably end up kitting to this, like the modularity that we've seen on ships like the Hornet and the Cutlasses. Now, there was an image in a ship pipeline video a while back of a Sabre that had a different design, and you could tell it was a Sabre based on the cockpit and the weapon placements. So that was either an early concept image, or that was maybe an early sight of the ship that would become the Sabre Raven. It really had more of a diamond shape with the wings kind of swooping back to the tail of the ship in a more of a continuous section, and it's actually what's on the thumbnail of this video. And while that image adds to the overall cross-section of the ship, it could also give for more space for weapons, systems, coolers, or really anything to add to the overall firepower, stealthiness, or who knows what other direction they end up taking it. I'm not saying that is the design of the Sabre Raven, but it's the only different Sabre that we've seen in a more recent video that could potentially be it. The bottom line is we don't really know anything about this ship other than it carries the Sabre name, so it has to be similar enough to the original Sabre to keep that naming convention, at least in my mind. So as soon as we get more information on the ship, you better believe I'm going to cover the heck out of it. Until then, I'd love for you guys to share your opinions in the comments. Stay tuned for more content coming very soon, and have yourselves a wonderful day. Take care.